Welcome back to But This Time It's Different, the show where we unpack geopolitical tantrums, economic plot twists, and why your favourite post-colonial miracle might be quietly falling apart under load shedding and legacy debt. I'm Sinead, a defence economist, and someone who once called South Africa a beacon before its electricity quite literally went off and it disappeared off the grid.
And I'm Alex, a technology and finance writer and someone who can't decide what's more unstable, South Africa's electricity grid or the ANC.
Yeah, so this week we're digging into a story that looks like immigration policy on the surface, but underneath, it's something slightly murkier, a political message, a reputational fracture, and a strategic warning shot.
So South African President Cyril Ramaphosa's recent meeting with Trump at the White House was captivating, if slightly bizarre and uncomfortable viewing at times, not just because we've come to see Trump's White House press conferences with world leaders as having this reality TV style drama, because only last week, white Afrikaners, which are the very people associated in the eyes of the world as the governing class of the apartheid regime, are now being offered US asylum.
And this comes after an Elon Musk-fueled far-right conspiracy theory that Afrikaner farmers are subject to a white genocide in rural South Africa has gained traction in recent weeks. So why was this meeting important? Why was it so shocking? Ramaphosa's delegation consisted of his coalition partners and trade union leaders, businessmen, and a pair of US Open Gulf champions. Trump was surrounded by, the usual suspects, and Elon Musk, whose 1 week in political retirement clearly left him at home, mowing the grass and not adequately satisfied by the recovery of his Tesla stock price, such that he decided to return into the political fray.
Yes, Sinead, I'm surprised, to be honest, that Ramaphosa didn't draw blood biting his tongue for that long. As first Trump asks for the lights to be turned down, and then the video purportedly showing evidence of white genocide was played, and it dragged on and on to delegate, to the delegations and the gathered press. And then you had the slightly surreal sight where, the president of the United States and leader of the free world was sort of thumbing through newspaper clippings and handing them over, showing the kind of reported epidemic of white farmer murders.
It was so horrendously difficult to watch. I mean, so even in the South African delegation, no one suggests that there are not attacks on white farmers or that the murder of white farmers does not occur in South Africa. However, what the room saw, other than Ramaphosa, who very stoically refused to turn and watch, was first a video of opposition leader and president of the Economic Freedom Fighters, Julius Malema, leading the song Kill the Boer. And secondly, a video of what Trump claimed were burial sites of white farmers that has been widely shared on social media since 2020. The video does not acknowledge where the crosses were placed and, its legitimacy has never been verified. However, many journalists believe that the crosses actually formed part of a protest against the government and police's lack of action against assaults and murders on farms in rural parts of South Africa.
And to be clear, neither of us is claiming that there are no problems in South Africa or that the economic freedom fighters are actually a great bunch of lads. And so experts claim that 50 farmers are murdered across racial lines every year. And that's obviously not an insignificant number, but I think we have to take a step back here and look at the context of South Africa's murder rates. And a staggering 27,000 people are murdered annually. And I had to double check this when I looked it up because that seems insane to me. But the majority of these are not white farmers. They're young black men in townships, which are enormous and are in themselves relics of, the apartheid era. So 50 murders a year is obviously terrible and it's tragic, but it hardly amounts to genocide as the term is sort of conventionally understood. But obviously, we now live in a world where empirical proof and even the anecdotes of a former champion golfer are worth less than the value of a narrative. So as a result, the South African government understandably believes Washington is employing some ideological warfare. And the story of white Afrikaner genocide might lose momentum in time, but Trump's weaponization of it is a glaring indicator of the precarious geopolitical position that South Africa finds itself in at the moment. And it would not surprise me if global investors are already quietly beginning to revise their exposure a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you kind of think about South Africa as having been this kind of democratic miracle Now it's a swing state, kind of caught between China and the West, and a past, honestly, that it can no longer weaponize.
Yeah, so I guess the interesting question for us today is what happens when historical memory loses its market value and when geopolitical credibility becomes your most volatile asset? So, Sinead, let's get into it.
Well, let's start with what unfortunately sounds like satire, but actually isn't. So, in early 2025, the United States began quietly approving asylum claims from a small number of white Afrikaners, citing group based risk and state tolerance of targeted crime, along with institutional neglect of white South Africans living in rural areas. And if you know the history, that should set off every alarm bell you have.
For context, Afrikaners, along with other white South Africans, are the descendants of apartheid's political and economic elite. They once wrote the laws, owned the land, held the keys to every bank, university, cabinet office in the country until 1994. On the day before Ramaphosa's visit to the White House, Senator Tim Kaine, remember him, once Hillary Clinton's running mate, asked the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio whether he thought the Afrikaner farmers are more persecuted than the Uyghurs, the Rohingyas, political dissidents in Cuba, Venezuela, or Nicaragua. And Rubio came out with a slightly bizarre response. He said words to the effect of the problem we face there is the volume problem. If you look at all the persecuted people in the world, it's millions of people. They can't all come here. That doesn't really answer the question of why the US is prioritizing Afrikaner farmers over any of these other persecuted groups.
I mean, I think this is an example of Republican math. So, in that hearing, Rubio made no attempt to conceal Trump's weaponization of this issue in his answer by saying that the US would welcome white Afrikaner farmers as refugees because, quote, it is a small subset, it's a new issue, and the president identified it as a problem and wants to use it as an example, end quote. So, the Secretary of State's answer to this question reveals that now, in the language of Western diplomacy, Afrikaners are framed as a vulnerable minority. And this is not just as victims of crime or bad governance, but as a class subject to systematic persecution, seriously putting into question the Trump administration's appreciation of the reality of apartheid era South Africa. And to the question of whether Rubio knew of any special program established during the apartheid era to allow South African blacks who were classified as second class citizens to claim refugee status in the United States, he answered by saying, no, because I was probably in 8th or 9th grade. And as we all know, if a world event happened before you get your first driver's license, you absolutely cannot be expected to know anything about it, even if you are pretty depressingly Secretary of State.
Yeah, and I think this is not just a bureaucratic shift from the US, it's an act of geopolitical performance, the kind of which we are becoming all too familiar with from this administration, because asylum ultimately isn't about individual protection. It's a gesture. It's saying, we recognize your danger and we no longer trust your government to protect you, which is obviously a deeply political statement. And as you say, this is complete narrative inversion. But I'm guessing this didn't come from nowhere.
Yeah, Alex, the groundwork was laid years ago. So back in 2018, South Africa's ruling African National Congress reignited debates about land expropriation without compensation, aimed at correcting apartheid era land theft. And it was mostly political theater. No sweeping land seizures happened, although Julius Malema, who Trump showed in his White House video, has vehemently promoted this policy. But the optics alone for Ramaphosa were enough to detonate global backlash in the conservative media sphere. Elon Musk tweeted about a white genocide. The Trump-era US State Department said it was monitoring the situation. Australia's then Home Affairs Minister, Peter Dutton, publicly offered fast-track visas to white South African farmers because why not? And more recently, Musk's influence resurfaced algorithmically in a kind of depressingly hilarious way. So a Grok user discovered that his Twitter chatbot had been responding to questions about South Africa with near-automatic claims that Afrikaners were the victims of genocide, echoing long debunked far-right talking points, but now dressed up as this kind of AI truth. So while the administration would never say it out loud, these asylum approvals are actually not new policy. They're the quiet continuation of this kind of reframing campaign already underway, and one that casts the Afrikaner not as a colonizer, but as a casualty.
I mean, in a way, asylum isn't about risk. It's, to an extent, in this slightly postmodern world we live in, about narrative positioning. And in this case, that positioning serves multiple functions. because it reads like humanitarian concern, but structurally it's a pressure tactic because South Africa isn't just any other country. It's a member of BRICS, which I know we both think is fake, but it will play into the US calculation. It trades heavily
Mhm.
with China. It filed a genocide case against Israel at the International Court of Justice, and it's increasingly charting a path outside the Western diplomatic and military umbrella. So, this policy, even if it only affects a few hundred people in South Africa, sends a bigger strategic message. If you move too far off script, we'll start reframing your internal politics as a human rights issue, not because of widespread suffering, but because of which group is suffering and how that plays internationally. To understand why asylum policy matters and like has turned into this sort of strange act of geopolitical positioning, you have to zoom out a bit. This isn't really about race. It's not really about the farmers. It's not really about the farmland. Although I'm sure some people do care about these things. I think that there's an obvious wider context here, and that context is that for the past 5 years, South Africa has been slowly drifting out of Washington's orbit. It's on the surface kind of Western liberal democracy. It holds elections. It trades with the West. It's been starting to make some interesting moves recently. In 2023, South Africa hosted joint naval exercises with Russia and China, literally while the war in Ukraine was raging. It's abstained on key UN votes. It backed the ICJ genocide case against Israel. It's flirted with de-dollarization and BRICS, even though we obviously think both those things are fake, but it gets a certain section of opinion in Washington agitated. And it's used the UN Security Council, the World Economic Forum, a bunch of other institutions to call for multipolarity and global South solidarity. And so from Washington's perspective, South Africa is no longer really a partner. It's a problem.
Yeah, Alex, and that is actually a very good description of this kind of quiet shift that we're seeing now. So, in public, the rhetoric is still about these kind of shared values: rule of law, human rights, development, cooperation. But under the surface, South Africa is being downgraded by Washington. Now, I don't mean like cut off, but just a little bit reclassified. So, no longer this kind of regional anchor state in the old Clinton era language. It's now more like a hedged exposure. Okay. It's this country that can't be trusted, but shouldn't be lost entirely. So, what does the US do? Well, it starts to use its old tools. Okay. What are those? Visa policy, grant approvals, like we saw with Doge, security cooperation, and finally now asylum. Not as a humanitarian response, but as a form of calibrated humiliation. And this is kind of Washington's way of telling Pretoria, we see what you're doing, and we will start framing you accordingly.
And Pretoria knows this. And in many ways, the timing just couldn't be worse for the ANC. They're not nervous that there's going to be some kind of revolution or uprising. They're just exhausted. And I speak to people I know out there, and everyone is just sick of them. I mean, the ANC has been in power for, is it 31 years now? They've lost their parliamentary majority for the first time ever in elections last year. The economy is stagnant. Youth unemployment is nearly 60%, which makes Spain sound like a kind of hive of economic dynamism. The state-owned utility Eskom can't keep the lights on. It was last year they celebrated when they managed to keep the lights on for a whole month. Then that pattern immediately broke down. Municipal governments are going broke. Corruption scandals have been chronic for years now. People can't rely on basic services. So the ANC is losing power and it's losing legitimacy. And increasingly, the US government can tell that. It feels relatively comfortable dissing it on the world stage. Marco Rubio hinted that he might not even attend the G20 when South Africa hosts it later this year. He publicly said that South Africa had been consistently unaligned with US policy, that it consistently voted against America's interests, said that its stance on Israel made him wonder if Iran was secretly influencing South African politics. Although, based on what I hear about the quality of politics in South Africa, I really don't think they need Iranian influence to mess the place up.
We shouldn't laugh, but I mean, the level of corruption in South Africa has arguably disastrous outcomes for people who live there, which it feels like if you don't laugh, you'll cry. So in this position, South Africa, yeah, is absolutely vulnerable. And obviously not just domestically, but diplomatically. Ramaphosa is trying to play both sides, which clearly is not working. So he needs Chinese investment, he needs Russian political cover, and Western market access. Like, this is a triple threat, and it's breaking down. The exposure that they have on all sides is clearly not working in their favor, because you cannot simultaneously call for de-dollarization, which, as we've said before, is complete bullshit, call for global South autonomy with no electricity, and expect Washington to keep treating you like the stable democracy that you're not, crucially for South Africa's largest agricultural sector, while creating duty-free access to the US market for eligible sub-Saharan African countries. In this situation, you are especially susceptible to punitive action when you filed a genocide case at The Hague against one of Washington's staunchest allies. And South Africa's move to bring Israel before the International Court of Justice was seen in obviously radically different lights. Okay, so to some, it was this kind of bold moral stand, reclaiming the country's legacy as a human rights leader. And to others, it was diplomatic provocation, reckless, opportunistic, and out of sync with Western consensus. But regardless of which side of that fence you're on, the fact remains that South Africa took legal action that directly challenged US strategic alignment. And in a world where moral clarity and foreign policy rarely coexist, that choice is having consequences that we're seeing play out in the Oval Office in the most humiliating of ways.
Yeah, the problem with trying to play the US, Russia, and China off against each other is they can actually all hear you and see you when you're doing it. You know, you can't rob Peter and rob Paul and hope like neither side will realize you're doing it. So yeah, this asylum move isn't random or bureaucratic. It is punishment wrapped in policy.
Okay, so let's talk about memory, because for decades, South Africa's political stability rested on one thing and one thing alone: the moral authority of history. Apartheid ended, Mandela forgave, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission set a tone that the world admired, and the African National Congress, the ANC, positioned itself not just as a party, but as the living memory of liberation. And this worked for a really long time. So for years, memory was this kind of political capital. And it was what gave the ANC moral superiority and this kind of international legitimacy, as well as staunch domestic loyalty. That memory now, however, is decaying.
Of course, because when apartheid ended, that was in 1994, over 30 years ago. And when 70% of your population is under 35 and 42% of eligible voters weren't born under apartheid, didn't live through Bantu education or forced removals or the police state, the direct memory of what the ANC saved the country from becomes politically less relevant. It loses its salience. While you might you'll have some awareness of history, what you're confronted to with day to day is state capture, crumbling infrastructure, corruption so systemic that in 2022, the government had to spend more on bailing out state-owned enterprises than it did on higher education. As a voter with economic needs, family, a future you care about, like, that gratitude is only going to last for so long.
Exactly that. So for young voters, history is not this kind of sacred thing that is remembered and lived through. It's totally irrelevant. And there's this kind of vacuum. And within this vacuum, identity starts to fragment. So the ANC still reference Mandela and the struggle. But honestly, for Gen Z, those feel like these weird bedtime stories told by granddad, and a party that has not fixed a single pothole in 20 years. Gen Z don't want stories, they want jobs, and they want power, electricity that works. They want land, transport, policing, not commemorations.
And the data backs this up. I mean, it's not necessarily that support has rushed to opposition parties in South Africa. People are just so disillusioned with the system, they're increasingly just not showing up. I mean, I think it was in the 2021 local elections where turnout among first-time eligible voters was under 20%, which is just shocking. And I think that was the year when the ANC first dropped under 50% in a national contest. But yeah, it shows that legitimacy is just being progressively eroded. And, it wasn't shocking when they lost their parliamentary majority for the first time last year, being forecast by basically everyone.
And the breakdown of this kind of political continuity. I mean, ANC have been in power, as you said, for 30 something years. This is also a breakdown in narrative continuity, because once the ANC loses its monopoly on long-term intergenerational memory, it also loses the monopoly on meaning. And people are starting to reframe the party not as this kind of symbol of peace and unity and advancement of South Africa, but of despair. And suddenly the white Afrikaner isn't a symbol of the old regime. They are now symbols of state failure and abandonment. And in this weird, twisted inversion, this white Afrikaner becomes legible again.
And this isn't just happening in South Africa. So, I mean, it's striking in Ireland. Obviously, Sinn Féin, once politically radioactive due to its links with the IRA, that Gerry Adams was definitely never in case
The
his
links to
lawyers
the
are listening.
IRA.
None whatsoever. Coincidence that he just seemed to hang around with them a lot. It's now like led in a lot of the polls. In Germany, the far right AFDs polling above 20%, and it has significant support from voters born after reunification, especially in the former East Germany. And in Brazil, Bolsonaro's openly nostalgic for the good old days of military rule and has a lot of support from people who never lived through the military dictatorship. And look, to be honest, quite a lot from people who did as well. Yeah, memory fades and myth reboots. I mean, actually, it's striking in Germany, which I mentioned, is it kind of guts both ways, that Die Linke in the German far left is enjoying a bit of a renaissance, and its roots lie in the old Socialist Unity Party that used to run East Germany. It was the successor to the Successor Party and is now pretty popular among the youth that aren't voting for the far right. Yeah, it cuts both ways.
I mean, it's interesting at that level, because what we're seeing in South Africa is being mirrored in so many places with this intergenerational loss of memory. But let's zoom out a little bit and make the connection between all of this stuff more explicit. So, like, going back to the White House, this is not just about asylum or geopolitics. Let's think about the markets for a second, because asylum is just not this kind of humanitarian language. It's an early indicator and this very soft but very real signal. And the moment the US starts to issue protection to white Afrikaners, global capital doesn't see refugee policy, it sees a pretty big fucking red flag.
Yes, because on paper, as we touched on, like, things aren't going wonderfully in South Africa, and there's a lot of political mismanagement. But yeah, on paper, the economic fundamentals aren't terrible. GDP last year grew by something like 0.6%, which is sluggish, but bluntly, a lot of European countries would kill for 0.6% GDP growth at the moment. Inflation is within the central bank's target range. Public debt is elevated, but it's at about 76% of GDP, a level of public debt, again, that many European countries would kill for. Foreign reserves are around $70 billion. There's been no IMF intervention. The country has an independent judiciary, broadly credible central bank, and a free press. So, in normal circumstances, this would be a cautious hold, not an urgent sell.
Right, yeah. And Alex, I'm going to be the cynic once again. I want to talk about the fact that capital doesn't price data in isolation. So right now, South Africa's narrative is disintegrating, even though those numbers on the surface seem pretty optimistic. And as we've mentioned a couple of times now, the ANC has lost its parliamentary majority for the first time since the end of apartheid. Okay. Youth unemployment is above 62%, and only 55% of South Africans live below the upper bound poverty line. Eskom is $26 billion in debt. Load shedding occurred on 330 days in 2023. It was considered a big deal when South Africa experienced a month without power cuts in 2024, although these resumed at the start of the year. And over 60% of municipalities are financially distressed. So, sure, these aren't just problems, they're big signals to capital markets.
And yet, bluntly, the other big signal to capital markets is when the rich people want to leave. That is usually a pretty bad warning sign if you're an investor. And this is straight from Albert Hirschman's classical political economy framework: exit, voice, and loyalty. So when the system starts to fail, people speak up. That's voice, clearly unhappy with the political system there. When voice fails, they leave, which they are either doing in small numbers through the asylum route, or they are marrying, or they are leaving, or just emigrating in droves. And in fragile democracies, exits come faster because loyalty is thin. Asylum is exit, capital flight is exit, and even this narrative breakdown is kind of an exit, because belief often disappears before the bodies do.
Right. And right now, the markets seem to be in this kind of suspended animation. As we know, these markets are changing every day at the moment, but the rand is trading near a 5-month high, just under 18 to the dollar. And 10-year bond yields are holding pretty steady around, 10.5%. So there's no panic, no fire sale just yet, which actually tells us something crucial. Washington's delegitimization campaign, subtle and strategic as they're trying to be, which Trump absolutely never is, it hasn't fully priced in yet. The markets are watching, but more importantly, they're waiting. They're not quite buying the story of delegitimization and economic collapse just yet.
And I think the most dangerous part here for South Africa is ultimately this isn't being decided in Pretoria. It's being decided in Washington, New York, and London by institutions who just no longer believe the story that they are trying to tell. And once belief is gone, spreadsheets follow. And then ultimately, this is how asylum policy bleeds into the yield curve. But I think we should widen the frame here a little bit, Sinead, because South Africa isn't the only country flirting with narrative collapse.
No, that is exactly right. So the super old, very French, and very sociologist type Jean-Francois Lyotard actually called this incredulity toward meta-narratives, which basically means we've seen this before and we know it's going to happen. And he described the collapse of big organizing stories that once gave political identity its moral weight. Liberation, democracy, revolution, justice. These used to mean something. And Lyotard said that in this kind of postmodern condition, we stop believing in big truths and instead we move through fragments. And that's pretty much what we're seeing today. In that South Africa is no longer seen as the symbol of democratic redemption. Instead, it is being sliced and diced into pieces. Crime statistics, power outages, asylum approvals. And what's lost is coherence. And instead, what it has gained is volatility.
I mean, the natural pushback would be that if you look at the United States, you have the country intensely polarized where seemingly the kind of two factions can't agree on basic reality, and that, the country's story as this champion of liberal democratic values of the free world, as the beacon that others can turn to for hope, is breaking down. But I think the difference is postmodernism is a luxury that middle countries can't afford. Whereas if you're rich and have all the guns, it's much easier to style out an existential crisis.
Right, exactly. The irony here is that the United States is in arguably a worse position than South Africa, yet it is calling out South Africa for doing exactly these things. So what we're probably seeing here is that South Africa is less a warning and more of a mirror. And it is a mirror for global South democracies and these kind of post-colonial republics that are holding onto these super old and very razor-thin legacy narratives, and that they will still mean something. Because when asylum becomes optics and risk becomes rumor, a country's reputation becomes an off-balance sheet liability. And after that, what is left?
On that intensely cheery note, Sinead,
yeah, this has been a bit of a downer, this podcast.
We should probably leave it here, but thanks for listening to But This Time It's Different, and we'll see you next time, provided you still believe in our meta-narrative.
Bye.
Bye.